In 1988, a group of treasure hunters in Kansas City started digging beneath a cornfield. 45 feet down, past waterlogged soil, past layers of silt deposited over more than a century, they hit wood. Not driftwood, not a collapsed barn, the hull of a full-sized steamboat, 200 feet long, loaded with more than 200 tons of cargo. The ship had sunk in 1856, but it was not at the bottom of a river. It was nearly half a mile from the nearest water. The Missouri River had simply walked away from its own wreck and left it underground, sealed in mud, in the middle of a farmer's field. That discovery alone would be strange enough, but the Missouri has been doing this for thousands of years, burying things, exposing things, moving entire landscapes sideways, and the list of what it has hidden, preserved, and occasionally surrendered is far stranger than most people realize. Today, we are going to look at 6 real discoveries connected to the Missouri River. A steamboat turned into an underground time capsule, evidence of a catastrophic battle fought centuries before Europeans arrived. The fossil of a giant marine predator found in a landscape that was once the floor of an inland sea. A cave whose relationship with the river has physically changed since Lewis and Clark stood inside it. An indigenous settlement whose buried defenses were invisible until researchers scanned the ground with magnetic instruments, and fragments of pottery carrying images so unusual that archaeologists still cannot fully explain what they depict. None of these stories require exaggeration. The documented evidence is strange enough on its own. Let's start with the steamboat. The Arabia was a side-wheel steamboat about 171 feet long, built in 1853. In the 1850s, the Missouri River was one of the most important commercial highways in North America. Steamboats hauled supplies, tools, clothing, food, medicine, and building materials to settlements and trading posts scattered across the frontier. The boats pushed upriver against one of the most unpredictable currents on the continent, dodging shifting sandbars, collapsing banks, and submerged trees that could punch through a wooden hull like a nail through paper. On September 5, 1856, the Arabia struck a submerged walnut tree trunk near the town of Parkville, Missouri, about 6 miles upriver from Kansas City. The hull was breached. The boat sank quickly, settling into the riverbed. Fortunately, most of the roughly 130 passengers managed to escape. One mule, chained to equipment on the deck, did not. What happened next is the part most people would not predict. The Missouri River does not hold still. It is one of the most geologically active rivers in North America, constantly eroding one bank, depositing sediment on the other, cutting new channels, and abandoning old ones. Over the decades following the Arabia's sinking, the river migrated laterally. The channel where the steamboat went down gradually filled with silt. Layer by layer, season by season, the wreck was buried deeper and deeper. Eventually, the old river channel became dry land. Farmers bought the property. Crops were planted directly above the sunken boat. By the mid-20th century, there was virtually no surface indication that a steamboat lay beneath the field. The Arabia became a local legend. People in the Kansas City area knew the story. A few attempts were made to find it over the years, but the depth of burial and the waterlogged soil made recovery impractical with older technology. Then, in 1987, a man named Bob Hawley and his sons began a serious search. Using historical accounts, old maps, and a magnetometer, an instrument that detects variations in the magnetic field caused by buried metal objects, they identified a promising signal beneath a field owned by a farmer named Norman Sorter. The anomaly was roughly half a mile from the modern course of the Missouri. What followed was one of the most ambitious non-governmental archaeological recoveries in American history. The excavation required pumping enormous volumes of groundwater out of the site continuously. The water table in that part of the Missouri floodplain is high. Without constant pumping, the hole would have flooded within minutes. The team set up industrial pumps capable of removing about 20,000 gallons of water per minute. They dug down about 45 feet, and there it was. The hull of the Arabia was largely intact. The wooden structure had been preserved by the anaerobic conditions created by deep burial in waterlogged clay and silt. Without oxygen, the bacteria that normally break down organic material had been severely limited. The ship was crushed and flattened by the weight of the overburden, but recognizable. The paddle wheel, the boilers, the structural timbers. And then there was the cargo. More than 200 tons of supplies had gone down with the Arabia. What researchers pulled out of the mud was not treasure in the conventional sense. There was no gold, no silver bullion, no jewels. What they found was something that, to historians, may have been even more valuable: a nearly complete cross-section of everyday American commercial life in 1856, preserved in extraordinary condition. They recovered boots and shoes, hundreds of pairs, some still supple enough to bend, bolts of cloth, pre-packaged foods, including pickles still sealed in glass jars, and brandied cherries preserved well enough that, reportedly, someone actually tasted one, bottles of perfume, carpenter's tools, nails, door hinges, buttons, china dishes, guns and ammunition, hats, doorknobs, entire cases of goods still packed for delivery. The preservation was remarkable because the deep burial in wet, oxygen-poor sediment had essentially freeze-framed many of the organic materials. Leather that would have disintegrated in an open-air site had survived. Textiles that would have rotted within years had remained intact for over 130 years. Historians quickly understood the significance. The Arabia was not a military vessel. It was not carrying anything exotic. It was a commercial supply boat headed for the frontier. That is exactly what made it extraordinary. The cargo represented what ordinary Americans in 1856 were buying, wearing, eating, building with, and trading. It was a snapshot of the material culture of an entire era, sealed in a single moment by an accident and then preserved by the Missouri's own geological behavior. The collection eventually became the core of the Arabia Steamboat Museum in Kansas City, which opened in 1991. Today, the museum holds one of the largest single collections of pre-Civil War artifacts in the United States, with tens of thousands of objects on display. And beneath other fields, other stretches of floodplain, other patches of ground that no longer look anything like a riverbed, there are almost certainly more wrecks. The Missouri consumed hundreds of steamboats during the era of river commerce. The Arabia is simply the one that was found, excavated, and given back to the surface. Think about that for a moment. If you had walked across that Kansas cornfield in 1985, you would have seen nothing but soil and crops. 45 feet below your shoes, sealed in the dark, a 19th century steamboat sat loaded with supplies that had never reached their destination. That is the kind of thing the Missouri does. Now let's move several hundred miles upriver to a bluff overlooking the Missouri in what is now central South Dakota. What researchers found at the Crow Creek site was not a shipwreck. It was not a time capsule of everyday objects. It was evidence of a disaster. In the early 1970s, construction work related to flood control exposed human skeletal remains along the eroding bank of a terrace above the Missouri River. Archaeologists were called in. What they uncovered over the following years became one of the most significant and most disturbing archaeological discoveries ever made on the Great Plains. The remains of at least 486 individuals were recovered from a mass deposit at the site. The bones were not neatly buried. They were commingled, disorganized, many of them showing clear evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries inflicted at or around the time of death, cut marks, fractures consistent with blows from weapons, evidence of scalping, evidence that bodies have been exposed to the elements before being deposited together. The site itself provided critical context. Crow Creek was a fortified settlement. A substantial ditch had been dug around portions of the village, creating a defensive barrier. Inside, archaeologists identified the remains of lodges and domestic structures consistent with initial coalescent communities, a term used for groups associated with a specific archaeological tradition in the Middle Missouri region, dating to roughly the 14th century. Radiocarbon dating placed the catastrophic event somewhere around 1325 CE, though the exact date has been discussed and debated over the years. This was approximately 170 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean, and more than 200 years before sustained European contact with the northern Great Plains. The question that faced researchers was straightforward but grim. What had happened here? The physical evidence pointed clearly toward a large-scale armed attack on the settlement. The trauma patterns on the remains, the scale of the killing, the presence of defensive fortifications that had apparently been breached, and the manner in which the dead were deposited all pointed in the same direction. This was not a gradual die-off from disease. It was not a famine. It was not a normal cemetery. It was the aftermath of organized, devastating violence. The significance of Crow Creek extended far beyond the site itself. For much of the 20th century, there had been a tendency in some popular and even some academic writing to minimize the scale and intensity of warfare in pre-contact North America. The reasoning was often circular. Because the archaeological record had not produced clear evidence of large-scale conflict, it was assumed that such conflict had not occurred, or had been limited to small raiding parties. European arrival and the pressures it introduced, firearms, disease, displacement, competition for trade goods, were frequently treated as the primary catalysts for major warfare among indigenous societies. Crow Creek complicated that narrative profoundly. Here was unmistakable evidence of a catastrophic, violent event involving hundreds of people, occurring centuries before Europeans had any significant presence in the region. The defensive architecture of the village itself suggested that the threat of large-scale attack was already recognized and taken seriously by the community that built it. People do not dig fortification ditches around their homes without reason. But why did the attack happen? Researchers have proposed several interconnected possibilities, though certainty remains out of reach. The 14th century in the Great Plains was a period of significant environmental variability. Droughts could reduce the productivity of the agricultural systems that sustained settled communities along the Missouri. When resources contracted, competition between groups could intensify. Population movements, territorial pressures, and the strategic importance of particular stretches of the Missouri, which provided water, fertile bottomland, and access to trade routes, could all have contributed. There is also evidence that the broader Middle Missouri region experienced periods of population aggregation and dispersal, with groups moving into and out of the river corridor as conditions changed. The Crow Creek community may have been caught in the tensions produced by these demographic shifts. What researchers are careful about is distinguishing what the evidence shows from what they are inferring. The physical evidence, the remains, the trauma, the fortifications, the stratigraphy, is solid. The motivations behind the attack, the identity of the attackers, and the specific political dynamics that led to the event are much harder to reconstruct. The people involved left no written accounts. The archaeological record can tell us what happened and approximately when, but it struggles to tell us exactly why. What Crow Creek demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt is that the capacity for large-scale, organized, and devastating violence existed in North America long before European contact transformed the continent. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is one the evidence supports. If this kind of discovery changes the way you think about the deep past of the Americas, consider what that means. We tend to assume that our picture of history is reasonably complete, that the major outlines are settled. Sites like Crow Creek remind us that the archaeological record still contains things capable of overturning assumptions that went unchallenged for decades. What was the Missouri hiding before this bluff eroded? What else is it still holding? Now we need to go much, much further back. Not centuries, but millions of years. Because the strangest thing the Missouri River region has revealed is not about human beings at all. In the early 1830s, near the Big Bend of the Missouri River in what is now South Dakota, fossil remains were found that did not belong to any animal anyone had ever seen alive. Parts of a skull, large and unmistakably reptilian, were recovered from the Cretaceous age rock formations exposed along the river. The animal eventually became known as Mosasaurus missouriensis. To understand what this creature was, you need to erase the modern Missouri landscape from your imagination. Roughly 80 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous period, the interior of North America looked nothing like it does today. A vast body of water called the Western Interior Seaway stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, splitting the continent roughly in half. What is now South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and large portions of the central United States lay beneath hundreds of feet of warm, shallow sea. In that sea lived mosasaurs. Mosasaurs were not dinosaurs, and calling them dinosaurs would be scientifically incorrect. They were marine reptiles, more closely related to modern monitor lizards and snakes than to any dinosaur. But they were enormous. Some species reached lengths of 40 feet or more. They were among the apex predators of the late Cretaceous oceans, fast, powerful, equipped with rows of sharp conical teeth, and fully adapted to aquatic life. Their limbs had evolved into flippers. Their tails were laterally compressed for propulsion through water. They breathed air, like whales and sea turtles do today, but they hunted, fed, and lived in the ocean. Mosasaurus missouriensis was a large species. Estimates based on skull fragments and comparisons with related specimens suggest the animal could reach lengths of roughly 20 to 40 feet, though exact size reconstructions remain debated depending on the material used. The discovery along the Missouri was historically significant for a reason that is easy to overlook today, but was enormous at the time. It became the first fossil reptile from the American West to receive a formal scientific name. At a time when the interior of North America was still being explored and mapped, the Missouri River was already yielding evidence that the landscape had a deep history far stranger than anyone had imagined. But the story of the specimen itself has a twist that illustrates a persistent problem in paleontology and museum science. The original fossil material from the 1830s discovery did not stay in one place. Portions of the skull were separated over the years and ended up in different collections. Part of the snout, a significant piece of the specimen, effectively disappeared from the scientific literature. It was not destroyed, it was not stolen, as far as anyone knows. It simply ended up in a museum collection where its identity was not recognized. Approximately 170 years later, researchers working on mosasaur taxonomy identified the missing fragment in the collection of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. The piece had been sitting in a European institution for generations, catalogued under a different identification, or perhaps simply overlooked in the vast holdings of one of the world's oldest natural history museums. This kind of thing happens more often than people might expect. Large natural history museums, particularly institutions founded in the 18th and 19th centuries, hold millions of specimens. Cataloging systems change over time. Labels degrade. Institutional knowledge is lost when curators retire or die. Specimens collected during one era may be re-examined decades or centuries later with new techniques, new questions, and new taxonomic frameworks, and their true significance may only become apparent at that point. Reuniting the Missouri fossil with its missing fragment was a small but meaningful victory for paleontology. It allowed researchers to refine their understanding of the anatomy and classification of Mosasaurus missouriensis, and to clarify its position within the broader mosasaur family. But step back from the technical details for a moment and think about the larger picture. Stand on the bank of the Missouri River in South Dakota today. You see grassland, cottonwood trees, muddy water, cattle ranches. The landscape feels ancient in a human sense, but the deeper truth is almost impossible to absorb. 80 million years ago, you would have been standing on the floor of an ocean, watching enormous marine reptiles hunt above you. The sediments that now form the bluffs and badlands along the Missouri are the compressed remains of that seafloor. The river has cut through them, exposing bones that were deposited when the continent itself was a different shape. The Missouri did not create these fossils, but by carving through millions of years of rock, it exposed them. And that pattern, the river as an agent of both burial and exposure, is one of the things that makes the Missouri corridor so scientifically productive and so consistently surprising. Now let's come back to the human timescale, but let's stay with the idea of landscapes that refuse to hold still. On the southern bank of the Missouri River in the state of Missouri, there is a natural rock shelter known as Tavern Cave. The name is old. The site has been used by human beings for a very long time. Indigenous peoples used the cave long before any European reached the area. The exact duration and nature of that use is difficult to establish with precision, but archaeological evidence and historical references indicate that the site served as a shelter and landmark along one of the most important natural corridors in the middle of the continent. When Meriwether Lewis and William Clark passed the cave during the early stages of their famous expedition in 1804, they took notice. Clark recorded the site in his journal, noting images and markings on the rock. One inscription visible at the cave has been associated with William Clark himself, though the attribution of specific historic markings at sites like this should always be handled carefully. Rock surfaces weather. Inscriptions are added, altered, and eroded over time. Attribution relies on comparison with known handwriting, historical documentation, and context, and in some cases, a degree of uncertainty is unavoidable. What is well established is that Tavern Cave was a notable landmark for travelers on the Missouri, and that the rock surfaces inside and around the cave bore a variety of markings from different periods and peoples. But here's the part that brings us back to the central theme. When Lewis and Clark described the cave, the Missouri River flowed immediately beside it. The cave entrance was essentially at the river's edge. Today, the river channel sits approximately 250 feet from the cave entrance. That distance represents more than a century of lateral channel migration. The Missouri moved. Not catastrophically, not in a single flood, but gradually, through the slow mechanics of erosion and deposition that the river practices constantly. One bank is eaten away, sediment is dropped on the opposite side, the channel shifts. Over decades, the geometry of the landscape changes. Tavern Cave itself did not move. It is carved into bedrock. But the river that once washed against the rock at the cave's mouth has relocated, leaving a strip of dry ground between the water and the entrance that did not exist when Clark stood there. This may sound like a minor geographic curiosity, but it matters enormously for understanding the archaeology of the Missouri Corridor. When researchers try to reconstruct how people used the river landscape in the past, where they camped, where they crossed, where they fished, where they docked boats, where they built settlements, they are working with a geography that no longer exists. The riverbanks, sandbars, islands, and channels described by historical observers may have moved hundreds of feet or more since those descriptions were written. Archaeological sites that were once on the river's edge may now be far from the water. Sites that were on high ground may have been undercut and collapsed into the current. Features described in one century may be unrecognizable in the next. Tavern Cave is a clean, physical example of this problem. The cave is anchored in stone. It stayed put. The river moved. The relationship between the two changed without either one being destroyed. It is like finding a dock standing in the middle of a meadow. The dock did not walk inland. The water retreated. Now scale that up to the entire Missouri River corridor, thousands of miles of constantly shifting channel, and you begin to understand why the archaeological record along this river is so fragmentary, so full of surprises, and so difficult to piece together. The past is there, but the landscape it was attached to has rearranged itself. The fifth discovery takes us to North Dakota, to a site called Double Ditch, and it involves something even harder to see than a cave entrance that has lost its river. Double Ditch is a large Mandan settlement site located on a terrace overlooking the Missouri River, about 10 miles north of present-day Bismarck. The Mandan people established and occupied the site over a period that may span from roughly the late 1400s into the 1700s, though the precise chronology has been refined through ongoing research. What is visible on the surface at Double Ditch is suggestive but incomplete. You can see depressions where earth lodges once stood. You can trace portions of two large defensive ditches that gave the site its name. The outlines of a substantial community are apparent, but what you cannot see from the surface is the rest. Beginning in the early 2000s, researchers from the State Historical Society of North Dakota and collaborating institutions applied geophysical survey techniques to the site. The primary tool was a magnetometer, the same basic technology used to find the Arabia steamboat, but applied here with much finer resolution and on a broader scale. A magnetometer detects small variations in the local magnetic field. Many archaeological features produce such variations. A pit that was dug, used, and filled back in will have a slightly different magnetic signature than the undisturbed soil around it, because the fill material is less compact, may contain charcoal or burned earth, and has been mixed differently. A hearth that experienced repeated high-temperature burning will have a strong magnetic signal because heating can permanently alter the magnetic properties of clay and soil minerals. Ditches, walls, burned structures, storage pits, and trash deposits can all create detectable contrasts. When researchers surveyed Double Ditch, the results were extraordinary. The instruments revealed features that no amount of surface inspection could have detected. Additional defensive ditches beyond the two visible ones. Bastions, projecting features along the ditch lines that would have allowed defenders to cover the approaches to the walls. Thousands of pits, interpreted as storage pits, trash pits, and other domestic features. Hearths, post-hole patterns suggesting structures that had left no surface trace. The settlement was significantly larger and more architecturally complex than surface evidence alone had suggested. The magnetic data allowed researchers to map different phases of the village's development, showing how it had expanded and contracted over time, how defensive lines had been repositioned, and how the internal layout had changed. But then the surveys revealed something harder to explain. In certain areas of the site, the magnetic data showed a pattern that was, archaeologically speaking, unusual. Before constructing some later structures, the inhabitants of Double Ditch appeared to have deliberately removed earlier cultural deposits. They had not simply leveled the ground and built on top of the accumulated remains of previous occupation, which is what happens at most long-lived settlements around the world. They had actually carried out substantial earth-moving operations to strip away earlier layers, removing the debris, fill, and accumulated soil that contained the archaeological record of previous phases of habitation. This is counterintuitive. At most multi-period sites, the past accumulates. Layer builds on layer. Tell sites in the Near East, for example, grow into artificial hills precisely because each successive community builds on the compressed remains of the one before it. The stratigraphy, the sequence of layers, is one of the most valuable tools archaeologists have for understanding a site's history. At Double Ditch, portions of that stratigraphy had been deliberately removed by the site's own inhabitants. Why? Researchers have considered several possibilities. It may have been a practical measure, clearing unstable or uneven ground to create level building surfaces for new lodges. It may have been connected to a deliberate reorganization of the village plan, perhaps in response to population changes or defensive needs. It may have been a cultural practice related to the abandonment of specific structures or the departure of particular households. Among some indigenous communities in the Great Plains, there are ethnographic references to practices connected with the life cycle of a dwelling, building, use, abandonment, and sometimes the deliberate destruction or clearing of a structure at the end of its useful life or upon the death of an occupant. But the honest assessment is that researchers do not fully understand the practice. The physical evidence, the absence of expected cultural deposits, the truncation of earlier features, the presence of later structures sitting on surfaces that should have been deeper, is clear. The motivation behind the behavior is not. This is worth pausing on. We can detect something that happened more than 500 years ago using instruments that measure variations in the Earth's magnetic field. We can map it with precision. We can date it approximately, but we cannot ask the people who did it why they did it. The tools give us the what. The why remains locked in a cultural context that was never written down and may not have survived in oral traditions in a form that directly addresses this specific practice. If you have been thinking about this river as a place that buries and hides things, Double Ditch adds a new layer to that idea. Here, it was not the river that erased part of the past. It was the people who lived beside it. They deliberately cleared away their own archaeological record, and the reasons they had for doing so may be something we can never fully recover. If this kind of mystery fascinates you, the kind where the physical evidence is real but the human story behind it is only partially recoverable, then this channel has more of it coming. Subscribe, because the deeper we go into the archaeology of North America, the more often the conventional narrative starts to feel incomplete. The final discovery is quieter than the others. No shipwrecks, no mass graves, no enormous fossils, just fragments of pottery. But what is on those fragments is one of the more genuinely puzzling things to come out of Missouri River archaeology. The Talking Crow site is located near the confluence of Campbell Creek and the Missouri River, in what is now South Dakota. Archaeological excavations at the site recovered an enormous ceramic assemblage, more than 56,000 pottery fragments. That number alone is significant. It indicates a substantial settlement with a long occupation or an intensive period of ceramic production, or both. The vast majority of these sherds, the technical term for pottery fragments, are what archaeologists would expect to find at a site associated with the archaeological cultures of the Middle Missouri region. They can be analyzed for vessel form, wall thickness, temper type, surface treatment, and decorative technique. Most of the decorated pieces carry geometric patterns, incised lines, tool impressions, combinations of stamped or trailed designs. This is the standard decorative vocabulary of the region, well documented across many sites. But several fragments were different. These sherds carried representational imagery. Instead of abstract geometric patterns, they depicted recognizable figures, or at least figures that appear to represent living things. One fragment shows what appears to be a serpent-like creature. Another displays what has been interpreted as a paw or footprint motif, Other fragments show human figures or animals rendered in a style that is strikingly uncommon for the Great Plains ceramic tradition. Why does this matter? Because representational or figurative imagery, depictions of humans, animals, or narrative scenes, is genuinely rare on pottery from this region. The ceramic traditions of the Middle Missouri are overwhelmingly geometric. When archaeologists encounter a pot or a sherd with a picture of an animal or a person on it, they take notice, because it falls outside the expected pattern. The decorated fragments from Talking Crow were significant enough to become the subject of a dedicated study published in Plains Anthropologist, a peer-reviewed journal focused on the archaeology and anthropology of the Great Plains. So what do the images actually show? This is where archaeological interpretation gets difficult, and where honesty requires admitting the limits of what can be known. Researchers can describe the images physically. They can measure the incisions, they can compare the style and technique to other examples from the region, they can analyze the clay, the temper, the firing method, and the surface treatment. They can date the fragments approximately based on the associated cultural materials and the stratigraphic context of the site. What they cannot do with certainty is explain what the images meant to the people who made them. The serpent-like figure, for example, is it a depiction of a real snake, a mythological being, a water spirit, a clan symbol, a personal mark, a representation of a creature from an oral tradition that has not survived in a form accessible to modern researchers? All of these are possibilities. None can be confirmed through the pottery alone. The paw or footprint motif raises similar questions. Is it a literal animal track? A reference to a specific animal with cultural or spiritual significance? A territorial marker? A decorative borrowing from another cultural tradition? The object preserves the image perfectly. It does not preserve the intention. This is one of the most fundamental challenges in archaeology, and it is worth stating plainly. Recovering an object is not the same as recovering its meaning. Archaeologists can tell you what something is made of, how it was made, when it was made, and where it was found. They can compare it to thousands of similar objects. They can place it in a typological sequence. They can date it, photograph it, measure it, analyze its chemical composition, and publish it in a journal. But when the object carries a symbol or an image, and the cultural context that gave that symbol meaning has been disrupted, displaced, or lost, the object becomes a kind of locked message. The key, the shared understanding between maker and community, is gone. This does not mean the images are supernatural. It does not mean they are evidence of contact with unknown civilizations. It does not mean anything exotic or conspiratorial. It means that human expression is richer and more variable than surviving records can always explain, and that the archaeological record of the Missouri River corridor still contains things we do not fully understand, not because they are unknowable in principle, but because the specific knowledge needed to interpret them did not survive the centuries between their creation and their excavation. And that, ultimately, is the larger point these 6 discoveries share. The Missouri River is not simply a body of water. It is a geological engine that has been reshaping the middle of a continent for millennia. It buries steamboats under cornfields. It erodes bluffs and exposes evidence of ancient violence. It cuts through rock that was laid down on the floor of a prehistoric ocean, revealing the bones of creatures that have no living equivalent. It moves away from caves that were built at its edge, turning shorelines into meadows. It hides fortifications underground so thoroughly that only magnetic instruments can detect them. And it preserves in fragments of pottery images whose full meaning may be beyond recovery. Every one of these discoveries was real. Every one was documented by professional researchers, published in journals or preserved in museums, and connected to the Missouri by geography, geology, or the river's own restless habit of rearranging the landscape. The next time you look at a river, especially a big, muddy, slow-moving one like the Missouri, consider what might be underneath it, or beside it, or buried in a field that used to be its channel. The Missouri has been keeping secrets for a very long time, and the ones we have found are almost certainly only a fraction of what is still down there, sealed in the silt, waiting for the river to move again. If one of these 6 discoveries surprised you more than the others, say which one in the comments and tell us why. And if you know someone who loves archaeology, paleontology, or the hidden side of American history, share this video with them. Some stories are too strange to keep to yourself.